Okay, thank you all for being around and listening to this conversation of the next half an hour, 45 minutes. I'll take you through a few details that we've put together as what we call the sustainability culture perspective, which doesn't necessarily get enough attention in the conversations that are happening today in the corporate world around corporate sustainability and things of that nature. So we'll get things going from there, and I'm going to start with putting things on slideshow. So, right. So, with that said, now this whole topic that I've chosen, sustainability through sustainability culture, is like a tongue twister. It is like a tongue twister because it's definitely got a lot of things that are put within that one statement. In which case, I'm just trying to spend some time on understanding this phrase sustain. The three times that sustain kind of occurs in that very title. uh, the first time it says sustain, it's of course trying to kind of mention the longer run of what we would want to happen with our planet, with our behaviors, with our initiatives that we are taking, the sustenance of what we want to happen. Emphasis, the first word. Thereafter comes the word that says sustainability, and here we're referring to actions that are happening at an institutional level, at an individual level. All of it has to kind of happen or is already happening today as we speak, and will happen through the rest of the decade, if not even further ahead, right? So sustainability is essentially trying to say whatever actions you take today, do we actually have does it run the long distance? And that's what we're talking of when we say sustainability. And how are we planning to do that? We're saying let's look at sustainability culture as a tool, as an approach method to get there. And that's what we will emphasize upon. We'll talk a lot about this aspect of sustainability culture, and understand what does it mean, why is it relevant, is it really relevant. At no point during this conversation are we saying that the typical DNA of any sustainability initiative, which is environment, which is social, which is governance, and things of that nature, are less important? We are only trying to mention that these aspects of ES and G should probably be complemented with what we call sustainability culture. And then that's what we will try to emphasize. And as we go further on, let's try to understand why are we even talking about sustainability culture, right? We'll get there. So sustainability culture is essentially an aspect that we need to look at if you wanted to consider the fact that uh, the initiatives that you're taking today should run much longer in terms of the impact they leave behind, in terms of the behavioral changes they leave behind. And why is that important? We're talking of climate action. We're talking of climate action that's immediate and long lasting. Climate action that is immediate in the sense that we're talking of things that have to happen today in terms of institutional efforts. Let me put it this way, right? We've got a timeline that we're seeing on our screen: 2021 to 2030, 2030, 40, and 50, and thereafter. But this particular window is the super crucial one. Why is it super crucial? Because this is what we are calling as the decade of action. This is exactly why conversations are happening so much more on climate action and sustainability, conversations and dialogues like the ones that you've been attending all day today. Now, here is where we want to make talk of how we could really bend the curve, how we could really have immediate actions, immediate impact through institutional efforts, climate action efforts, evolution of technologies, whether it's green tech, clean tech, climate tech, and everything that comes in between. So essentially, what is it that we should do in terms of innovation and everything that has to be implemented, so that the curve, when I say the curve, I'm referring to, of course, the temperature rise, the global warming aspects that we're talking of. How do we lessen the steep curve that we have? And that's the immediate part. But is that going to be sufficient? Is that going to be uh, enough for all of us to kind of have attended to the biggest challenge that humankind faces today? Unfortunately not. And what does it mean? What else should we bring in? We need to have a long lasting aspect to it as well. While we need something to happen immediately, we also not need to kind of keep an eye on how we make this long lasting, so that, unfortunately, so we shouldn't really come to a situation where we are going on a backward spiral. Unfortunately, so you should not come to a point where you said all the gains that we have made because of the efforts we took here are gone to the dust because of some sort of a behavioral changes that have not come in. And that's exactly what we will talk about here. We need something to happen alongside the immediate impact, which is to say that the foundational aspects of the cultural shift, the behavioral shift, the learning aspects have to happen in this decade. And if that were to happen right, then you are more or less assured that it becomes an ingrained aspect. And this is exactly where the whole idea of sustainability culture comes into play. If you happen to have these aspects addressed at the very early days, which is now, you will definitely have ingrained those behaviors, and they become second nature for you to kind of leverage the benefits of everything that you did in this decisive decade leading up to 2030. And that's the context in which the sustainability culture conversation becomes a lot more important. Let's take it a step further. What do we believe are the ingredients of sustainability culture? Now, sustainability culture, I think it's a fairly straightforward terminology. We're talking of organizations, corporate culture, and how do we make sustainability a theme in that whole setup, in that whole culture DNA of the organization. And that's where we'll see what is it that we have to emphasize upon. We need to look at the process. While I told you that E, S, and G, the environment, social, and governance aspects, which are important for any corporate sustainability efforts to truly bear fruit, is important. It is something that has to also be done right. It's not just about doing it, but doing it right. And doing it right would have meant that you need to really account for the fact that at the end of the day, this is a long term roadmap. This has to go through a journey in phases, very structured, very planned, very methodical. And that's what we're putting out there. The process is as simple as these four words. I mean, very commonplace, very simple words: learn, act, achieve, and celebrate. Now, irrespective of where one would sit on the organization hierarchy, you may be a C-level exec, you may be a middle management person, you may be somebody who's doing the work of an employee, regular employee. Irrespective of where you sit in the organization's hierarchy, you always will have to go through a process that's as simple as this. You got to, of course, learn a lot about what sustainability or ESG or anything that is about climate action is about, because that's at this point, quite honestly, a term that's got a varying number of interpretations. It's multi-dimensional. So how much could you possibly learn about sustainability and improve your sustainability quotient, such that once you've done that exercise, you are in a position to decide your next best action? Then you enter the act phase. You've learned enough that you had to learn. You've got to know what you have to do. You've probably chosen your battles already. And now is the time to kind of put that into action. When I say action, we're talking of projects that could be about carbon reduction, projects that could be about carbon avoidance, projects that could be about carbon removal, carbon offsets, and things of that nature. That's the kind of act that we're talking about. But all of these, of course, are not something that will happen in a short span. These projects take time. In fact, the not just the project execution, the outputs, the outcomes, and the impacts that come out of these projects take a lot of time. And that's why the act phase by itself becomes a super crucial time for you to see what happens when rubber meets the road. It's one thing to kind of look at things at a very uh, theoretical level in the beginning in terms of the learn phase, but another to see it in action, see the implementation happen, and then understand where you possibly can tweak a few things, if at all. That's the act phase, right? You got to see the outputs, outcomes, etc. And that'll only come when you implement things right. Once you've implemented things right and you're starting to obviously see the trajectory, the progress of your plan, of your projects, you come to a point where you start also noticing how your different milestones are getting achieved. You're reaching the progress timeline according to the plan, and that's the place where you talk of achieve. And yet again, I repeat, it isn't necessarily meant for the leadership team only. It isn't meant for the junior worker only. It's meant for the organization as such. And once you reach a point where you are observant, you're already aware of how you're progressing based on the milestones, you know that that is reason enough for you to call out for a sort of a pat on the back, a celebration of sorts. Because at the end of the day, for a long term roadmap like this, it's very important from a culture perspective also to have a pause and kind of celebrate the wins, and potentially, if not celebrate the wins, also look at what you've gained out of the learning experience, even if it wasn't exactly on the lines that you anticipated it to be. The celebrate need not necessarily be about the positive gains. It could also be about the learnings that you've had, every piece of experience that you've had in this journey, which could, of course, have a good mix of success and failures. Let's be honest, there's no playbook to drive sustainability to the T today. And so there could be a lot of ups and downs. And whatever you stage you get to this point, make sure you pause, make sure you reflect, make sure you also give yourself a pat on the back wherever it deserves one. Right? That's the idea. This process is an essential aspect of sustainability culture. Now, while you will of course do the whole carbon footprinting, the whole science-based targets, the whole GHG protocol, and everything that goes underlying it, climate science and social impact and everything. Let's also understand, apart from the technicalities, we also need to consider the softer aspects like the culture, and that's what we are going to talk about. That's the process dimension of sustainability culture for you. Let me bring in another dimension. That's the people dimension. Now, we all know that sustainability in the corporate context has a wider ambit in terms of the stakeholders it touches upon, internal and external both. Internal stakeholders in this context, we are referring to people like the employees, the mid management, the senior leadership, the boards, etc., etc. So these are the internal stakeholders. Of course, there could be other parties, but broadly saying, speaking about the stakeholders, this is the broad buckets that we could put them under. External stakeholders, from a sustainability culture perspective, we would say suppliers and distributors come to the fore. There are of course other parties like the investors, the creditors, the regulators, etc., who are also equally important external stakeholders. At this stage, we're talking of the fact that we have to go through the process and as a part of the sustainability culture imperative. And that is why I've kind of mentioned a couple of very key stakeholders here. By no means is this list the most exhaustive one, but this captures the most relevant uh, section of the stakeholders for this kind of process to be driven and sustainability culture to be achieved. So if in the long story short, what I'm trying to say is, if you look at process and people dimensions and you align them well, they're like these arrows are trying to point out here, you have a much better chance of, one, understanding what it means, two, implementing it right, and three, gaining the best impact possible out of the whole initiative, whole roadmap that you've put together for your organization on sustainability. So that's the way I would say, these two are the most essential ingredients, the process and the people. Now, if that is what it is, what does it take to make sustainability culture happen? Is it is it is it something that we could break down? Is it something that we could understand a little better? Now let's do that. We'll stick to the same process. We're not going to deviate too far, because this is something that I believe is a very important aspect. So we'll not go away from it. We'll stick to it and try to break it down from here. So I'm going to talk of learn to begin with. Now at learn, and in a stage when you're learning, you're talking of more of the approaches that are a lot more educative in nature, a lot more informative in nature. And how do they come about? They come about when you conduct, for your internal stakeholders, for your employees across the hierarchy, some sort of an awareness workshops. Because let's be honest, sustainability as a term need not necessarily be understood by everyone in the organization, and need not necessarily be understood by everyone in the same manner across the organization. So that is why the awareness workshops for the different sections of your hierarchy is an important aspect of driving the learn phase through the educative approach. And of course, you would have come across a lot of information, a lot of news these days, where there's a demand for sustainability professionals. Companies are trying to hire people and find people for that skill set, and there's a dearth of that skill set in the market. And if that is so, why is it that we could not consider skilling sessions for your employee group, so that you could potentially build a sustainability team well within the organization? That's one bit. But the other bit, if you were to build a sustainability team within the organization, that's one aspect. But what about the fact that we all know sustainability is a horizontal aspect that touches pretty much every department, every team in the organization? And which means that every team, every department, every person in those departments potentially should have a sense of sustainability in a manner that he or she can relate to in his daily work routine. And that's where the skilling sessions for each of those different sections uh, of the people in the organization come in, right? So that's the educative approach. Let's take it a step further. Act. What are we talking about in act? We mentioned the fact that after having learned, here's where rubber meets the road. Now when rubber meets the road, when you are trying to act on your sustainability roadmap, you need to have the right people having the right ideas and potentially having an approach that is a lot more entrepreneurial. And that is why we say ideation and entrepreneurship, which is of course entrepreneurship within the organization, that has to come out to the fore. Participative approaches is about saying how do you reach your employee segments and say, let's make you an equal participant in our plan to act on these sustainability initiatives. And in which case we want you Mr. Employee, to solve this problem that we are facing. Can we do this together? And that's the ideation, that's the entrepreneurship, that's the involvement that you're driving your employees towards. Volunteering. There's a lot of opportunity for your employees to participate in the initiatives that you take up for sustainability. Now, these could be something on the lines of social volunteering. It could also be on the lines of technical skills that one has that could help in even environmental mitigation, carbon emissions mitigation aspects. So, volunteering is an important aspect, and the whole way volunteering is being approached could change, or should change rather, in the context of what we're calling sustainability culture and ESG. Then we should also look at the fact that what are the alternatives in the operations today, within the corporate context, in the operations that we are running today. Are there operations to switch over to a greener approach, greener alternative? And that's what we're talking of. If there is a greener alternative, can we switch over to that particular alternative? Now once that were to happen, of course you have transitioned away from what is called a brown economy approach to what could be a green economy approach, which means that the mitigation of the emissions that you envisaged initially could be much easily achieved if you were to have the switchover alternatives identified and acted upon. So that's the act phase. I take it a step further and I look at achieve. Here we talk of explorative means. What do I mean by that? I mentioned the fact that during the act phase you are progressing on your journey, and as you progress on your journey, you got to be aware that there will be small milestones that you will cross on the roadmap, and those milestones are important for you to be aware of so that you can tick them off. You are very aware of what you're achieving as you are acting based on what you've learned, right? So that's why the journey milestones are an important aspect of being explorative, being aware. Behavioral shifts. While you've started acting, while you've probably also identified switchover alternatives, you would also want to see the employee behavior changing, shifting by default towards sustainability. And that's not an easy nut to crack. So that's where I think the most effort of any company who wants to implement sustainability culture would go. How do we drive these behavioral shifts? How do we make this whole activity of sustainability second nature? That's the idea there, right? And then we need to have rather a very clear awareness of the impact that our actions are achieving on the ground. What does that mean? You would have heard of outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Of course, impacts are a little long termish. Outcomes are something that happen more or less in the midterm, and outputs are very easily observable immediately in the near term. But at the same time, how aware are you about all the actions that you're taking, and are they leading you in the direction of achieving what I would have called the optimal impact out of those actions? And again, here we need not necessarily say impact is on the environmental dimension only. We could have environmental, social, governance, a lot of different types of impacts all put together. But being aware of what that impact looks like, how it's being achieved, if at all, through your work is an important aspect of being explorative out here. And then there is of course the celebration part. Now no initiative would kind of get its due recognition if the broadcast, if the communications that have to happen after the initiatives are kind of done isn't clear and reaching the right stakeholders. So this, what I'm mentioning here, is the broadcast, the communications that we are sending out to different stakeholders, internal and external, and the way it reaches them in a manner that they appreciate the value that has been brought together through the whole work on this roadmap. At the same time, along with the communication, we should also be aware that the incentives and the reward mechanisms that the organization follows, that the corporate follows, is an important aspect. If you are able to identify a way to kind of link your rewarding mechanisms, incentive mechanisms to the requirements of what I would have called the sustainability culture kind of DNA, then I think that is the kind of push that the employees or people across the organization would need to make it very much like a second nature aspect. So rewarding right is an equally important part. So that's the way I would have broken it down. A good point for me to kind of see if I could take a pause, have any questions if at all. I'll probably take a quick look at the chat and see if there's any questions. We also have academic research in the learn part, of course. Yes, I think that's someone from some Mahmood, I guess, who's asking that question. Yes, in fact the learn part is a lot more exhaustive. Of course, the 2 points that I've mentioned there couldn't have done justice to everything that could have gone into the learn part. But yes, very true. Anything that comes from research and academia, anything that comes from the think tanks, anything that comes from proper research like the IPCC, everything is an equally important part of the learn process, right? I don't see any more questions, but keep dropping in questions if you have any in the chat box. I'll see if we could get to that, and I'm going to go forward with my conversation at this stage. So that was our quick take on breaking it down. Now I'm going to take it one step further. I want to introduce what is called the ESG and C distinction. I think by now we would have guessed what that C stands for. C is for culture, and ESG is something we all are aware of. That's ESG for you, and C is for culture. So let's understand that piece a little more. What does that and C actually mean, and how will we do that? We'll try to do this through different scenarios that I'm hoping we can relate to much easily, because of the fact that you are today sitting in these sessions. You have brought to this table a sense of understanding of how corporate sustainability is working in the technical sense of the word. Let's get there and we'll see the scenarios. Let me put one scenario out here. We're talking of portfolio shifts to green economy. What do I mean by that? The fact is, there's this brown economy and there's green economy. Brown economy is carbon intensive. Green economy is of course carbon light, and it's not the it's in fact the ones that should be promoted a lot more, to if you were to look at abating or avoiding emissions. But then easier said than done, also because there's a lot of sectors in the market, a lot of industries in the market today who unfortunately belong to what is called the hard to abate sectors, emission intensive sectors like energy, infrastructure, etc. So they cannot totally shift from the brown economy to the green economy, yet they have to make a transition happen. They have to shift their portfolios gradually, if not in quick time. And that's why it requires a multi-year, multi-stakeholder, multi-pronged approach, and more importantly, enterprise-wide momentum to drive that. So that's the scenario for us. Imagining that a corporate wants to kind of shift its portfolio from the brown economy centric offerings that it has today to the green economy centric offerings. Simple example, just to give you before I move forward, is an oil and gas company that is also going to now start a renewable energy portfolio, so that they generate energy from renewable sources as much as they've been doing from oil and gas in the past, and gradually shift away from oil and gas and enter the renewable energy space. So that's an example that I would want to cite. But if that was the example, I want us to kind of look at the people aspect now. Who are the people who get involved? We looked at the people dimension a while back, internal and external stakeholders. I am just putting a layer of additional information on top, which is to say, for this particular scenario that I'm talking about, who's going to be impacted most, who's going to be impacted in a very medium sort of a manner, and low impact, or low, who's involved more. So very obviously, because this is talking about portfolio shifts, these are decisions that happen at a very senior leadership level. Any change in the mix of offerings, in the mix of services and products that an organization is delivering to its customers, will have to happen at this stage. So which is why you see the senior leadership is highly involved. But you also see that the mid management, the employees and the suppliers here have to be involved. They need to have enough skin in the game. Otherwise this portfolio shift would never happen, will never be a reality beyond the paper that would have been released by the senior leadership saying we will shift. So that paper has to have some substance, and that substance will come when these guys put their act together. So that's why you see a sort of a mid green kind of a shade that goes with these three. And then I've got the distributors who are not necessarily are unimportant, but not as important as the others. And that's why in the stakeholder mix, we're saying different stakeholders have different sense of involvement in this particular scenario. And if that was the scenario, those were the stakeholders impacted. Let's see what the approach that I am talking to you guys about would look like. Now, there's this ESG approach. That is what I think is traditionally the case. Most corporates do take the ESG approach, which is, of course, like I said at the very beginning, an essential aspect of driving corporate sustainability. But what does that entail in the context of this scenario? We're talking of course, mitigation of carbon footprint, because we're shifting from the brown economy to the green economy. So, of course, there will be reduction of carbon footprint, and that's what this ESG approach will help you do. Of course, it will. It also will help you drive what is called responsible business operations, responsible from an environment perspective and from a social perspective also at times. So it helps you drive responsible business operations if you were to look at the ESG approach. It also, because you have, if you are shifting your portfolio from the brown to the green, you need your supply ecosystem to align itself as well. So there's a strong focus and strong emphasis on supply chain alignment in this process of the ESG approach. Now, if I were to look at that and then say, let me add the C dimension to it. That's what I'm doing here. I'm calling it the ESG and the C distinction. So everything that we talked of in the ESG approach, which is on the left side, is still relevant. What's going to be added on? The fact that because you're focusing on culture, because your focus on culture is through the people and the process aspects, you will see minimal resistance to change. Let's be very honest. Any change in the corporate context, or for that matter in our personal context, we don't like it so much. We resist change. If things are going well at this point, why bother changing, is how typically human psychology works. And in which case I'm saying, even in the enterprise context, that's the same thing. And so if you were to tell everybody in your organization that we change our portfolio to move from brown to green, they won't be very gung-ho, very excited about it. So in spite of that, how do you kind of address that? If you were to kind of look at the people and the process aspects thoroughly enough, such that your culture is addressed, and that's when you will also come to a point where there's minimal resistance to this enterprise-wide change. There's a stronger motivation, because the learn aspects, especially if you look at it, would have already informed them, would have made them aware of why it is such a important thing to consider going green. And that's why there's a stronger internal motivation across the stakeholders to drive the transition. And importantly, more further, supplier connect. Now suppliers also see how you are going about this exercise. They also see how you want them to align closely with them. And that, when done right in the culture dimension as well, you will kind of walk out of this conversation on the portfolio shift with a stronger supplier connect between yourselves and your bunch of suppliers. So that's scenario one for you, right? I'm going to keep it going into a couple more scenarios, and let's try to understand this better. Of course, the scenarios start off on a very technical note, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes explaining each time we start a new scenario. But we've got to understand as we go further down, what does it actually mean for you and me? That's the idea. So internal carbon pricing, and now I'm hoping that you have heard that terminology a while back, sometimes in your workplace, or if you probably have already been doing in your organization, even better. What's internal carbon pricing? It's a mechanism, it's a tool that is coming to the fore. It is becoming super important to drive what is called operations wide sensitivity to carbon emissions. It's essentially a way to say, any emissions, any carbon emissions that are happening in my organization, I'm going to put a price to it. Going to put a figure to it, such that it becomes very financial. Otherwise, these are emissions that are going out of your operations, and you tend to kind of not be sensitive to it, because there's no financial metric associated with it. But the internal carbon pricing would do it for you. It'll give a metric. So more emissions that your department, your team, your organization is causing, the higher the impact on financials, because of the ICP, the pricing that you're associated with each ton of GHG gases that's going out there. If leveraged right, and that's an important part, because this is a tool that needs to be leveraged right. Otherwise, it's something that can easily fall through the cracks. So if leveraged right, it's a tool that can help companies achieve what is called the low carbon transition pathway. We all know companies have declared carbon neutrality, net zero, etc., etc. And in which case, if they have to achieve it by the year that they have set the target for, then they need the right tools to kind of get there. And ICP is a super easy, super wonderful, super nice tool to get there. Amongst all the other ways to do it, I would say ICP definitely yes. And along with the SBTs, which is science-based targets, it helps in making key decisions like investments. Where do you want to put your capex into? Should you put into project A or project B? How do you want to distribute your budgets between your departments? How do you decide which department gets how much of the budget? What is your performance incentives? If somebody performs well on the lines of saying his or her work, his or his team's work, his or her department's work has resulted in reduction of emissions, that's the performance I'm talking about. How do you incentivize that? All of those are decisions that can now be easily made, because now ICP, the carbon emissions, are now having a metric called the pricing, which is associated with them. And that's what companies are trying to roll out, and leverage this as a tool to drive enterprise-wide change on the carbon emissions front. Who are the stakeholders here? You would see that the dark greens have shifted to all the internal stakeholders. Like it's enterprise-wide. We clearly said that more than a couple of times till now. So if it's enterprise-wide, then each of these guys have a role to play, and a highly important role to play. The external world could also be involved. If first of all the company, the organization has got this going with the internal, extension would then be to go to the external stakeholders and say, we will also have ICP as one of the parameters to decide on whom do we take our supplies from, whom do we engage with as our distributors and dealers and franchisees, if at all. So, but they're not as super important, as significant as the internal stakeholders are, and that's the representation you see here. Now, again, taking it to approach. The ESG approach is all about bringing ICP into operational decisions, which is, of course, what's happening within your own operations. ICP into procurement decisions. This is about saying how are you engaging with your suppliers, and how does carbon pricing become a significant aspect of those conversations? How are you asking them to change their approaches to bring in a change in their own behaviors? And other important thing is ICP in capex decisions, capital investments. Where do you want to put your money? You have a corpus. Where do you want to put that money? Should it go into, like I said, project A versus project B? And that's the kind of decision that we are taking when it comes to the ESG centric approach. Now, when it comes to the C distinction, we're talking everything in the ESG approach, plus the fact that a multi-stakeholder, multi-party kind of requirement like this one needs engaging teams across the business. You cannot have teams that are left out of this equation. So they are teams, there should be teams that are involved pretty much end to end across the dialogue, and that's where you want them to be engaged across the business. At the same time, you want to ensure easier buy-in from stakeholders, and this stakeholder conversation, this stakeholder mention, is to both the internal and the external stakeholders. It'll help you as you roll out ICP, while considering the fact that it's so much to do with people changing their behavior. You got to be aware that at the end of the day, adoption of ICP is all about people behavior. And if you were to look at it that way, you need to have the easier buy-in from stakeholders, so that there's no need for them to there's no push from them against your push for ESG adoption and ICP adoption. At the same time, you're talking of behavioral change. ICP is a tool that can drive behavioral change across the organization very, very fruitfully, so because it's got a financial dimension to it. And that's why behavioral change in the company is something that could be emphasized upon if you were to look at culture as well as much as you do look at the ESG. So that's the key difference that will come in when you add the C dimension, the C distinction to the conversation, to the scenario on rolling out ICP across the organization. I have one more scenario, and this one is called green procurement. Now, of course, anything that has to happen within an organization, anything that has to happen from a carbon neutrality, net zero perspective, needs an alignment with the supplier side of things, because a lot of footprint typically is coming from scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, because suppliers are a key constituent of the scope 3 emissions, and they pretty much determine a lot of the footprint that comes into your overall mix, because of the fact that they have adopted approaches that they typically follow in their operations. Now, how do you kind of go about that? So we want to talk of minimal footprint of all the operations and products, all the supplier operations and products here. Now, who are the stakeholders involved? Very, very obviously, suppliers are high impact. But at the same time, you would notice that the mid management, who typically works, mid management and employees who typically collaborate and work with the suppliers, are going to be the important stakeholders here. You would also see that the distributors, who, after having procured the greener supplies, the manufacturing has to happen, and then it has to, of course, reach the market through the distributors. They become also involved as a medium priority kind of stakeholder. And then there's the senior leadership. Quite honestly, senior leadership has to set direction in this one, but the hard work, the lifting of the weight is done by these guys, the employees, the mid management, and the suppliers, and that's why they get a lot more focus in this one. If that is what it is, let's again go back to the same approach of looking at the ESG and the ESG and C. What's the ESG looking like? Green procurement policies and checklists. Every company today is intending to, or is already doing this, where they've released green procurement policies, which tells that they will only source their supplies from suppliers who have adhered to some bare minimum criteria. And these criteria typically on the environmental aspect, on the social aspect, on the governance aspect, includes things like ethics, include things like community impact, includes things like diversity, includes things like your own carbon footprint. So all those aspects come into here picture here, and that's what an ESG approach would have definitely considered when you talk of green procurement. Supply chain alignment. We are clear that all of this is being talked about only because there's got to be a greening of the entire supply chain. The entire supply chain has to become sustainable, and that's why supply chain alignment on this subject is an important aspect that will also be emphasized upon when you talk of the ESG approach. And quite obviously, because we're talking suppliers, we're talking supply chain, scope 3 emissions, which is what is happening with the value chain, becomes the key focus, core focus of this particular approach. How are you mitigating, how are you addressing the scope 3 emissions in your portfolio? That's the ESG approach. When you add the C dimension, it gives you a stronger internal stakeholder, external stakeholder alignment. I did mention that these suppliers work very closely in tandem with these employees and mid management. So that's the internal and that's the external. If you look at it from a process and people perspective that we've discussed earlier, that alignment, that cohesive approach between these stakeholders is a lot more prominent. And then you also would have come to a stage where the value chain disruptions are minimal. Why is it so? Because you got a very strong alignment on the cultural aspect now. It is no longer about transactional needs only. You got a cultural alignment, and that's why value chain disruptions would be lesser. Also because your suppliers are taking more confidence in your approach, and that is why they would ensure that the value chain disruptions for your business are minimal. Then there's the clear and consistent communication we're talking about. So it's important that for your internal and external stakeholder conversations, which is what is kind of represented here, you need to have a clear and consistent communication. There's no way these results could be achieved on green procurement if that consistent and clear communication was not a key aspect of your armory, if you've not considered that yet. So that's the three scenarios I wanted to paint. You would probably sense that the scenarios by themselves are very, very technical in nature, meaning to say they are very grounded in strong ESG kind of conversations. What we are trying to tell you is that with the C dimension, it gives it a fillip, gives each scenario a fillip in a manner that that behavioral change, that long-lasting impact that we spoke of at the beginning of our conversation, becomes something that is real and true. And that's what the ESG and C distinction would do. So let's take it a step further and try and conclude this conversation. What am I saying in conclusion? It's a simple two statements that I'm going to put out there. Addressing climate change through corporate actions can be done through a balanced mix of ESG. And this is something that we've heard enough. The key word here, of course, is balanced mix. You shouldn't be skewing yourself towards one of the three, ES and G, but a balanced mix is what we're talking about. And with that balanced mix, add a catalyst, add this catalyst of culture, and that would mean that it would amplify the impact and make it long lasting and make it real as well. So amplifying impact because it is now reaching more stakeholders in very connected manner, and making it long lasting because it kind of has its underlying foundation. The culture aspect has its underlying foundation in driving behavioral change. Like I said, the toughest nut to crack, but the best option when you talk of long term positive impact. So that's in a nutshell what we are talking about when we talk of ESG and C. Uh, Not so easy thing to achieve, like I keep saying again and again, only because the culture part, the behavioral change part takes a lot of considerations, a lot of efforts, and which is why I kind of run this organization, and we call ourselves at Quest, right? So I am the CEO there, and when we look at corporate sustainability, we present ourselves as the ESG and C team to our clients, and that's because we believe the culture dimension is an important one. So when we talk to our clients, we talk of our approach, our distinct approach to drive this ESG and C in tandem, and our approach is driven by starting small and kind of building over time. So we have tools in our portfolio. I'm not going to take a lot of time going through this, but we've got tools in our portfolio. We call this the SUS 360 benchmarker, the SUS 360 compass, and the climate care maturity model. With each tool, we have a strong focus on ESG and C, but of course at a different level of depth. So the depth only increases as you progress further. But to start with, there's a very simple assessment that we're talking of on the ESG and C aspects, which takes less than 30 minutes. Then I'm saying let's do a deeper assessment. 150 plus best practices across the globe on ESG and C. Let's look at each of them and see where you stand, where your company stands, and then that would take you about 2 weeks. And that's done through the SUS 360 compass. And once you've done that kind of an analysis, you know where your current standing is. You also get to know where your priorities are for you and your organization, and that will help you form the structured roadmap of initiatives, implementation of which will happen in a very professional manner with due regard for the process and people dimensions which we've spoken at length over the course of the conversation that we've had in the last few minutes. So that's the kind of approach we take, and that's what I believe should be done. Not saying that we're the only ones doing it, but this is something that stands out very distinctively in how we approach our conversations on corporate sustainability. I think with that said, I have come to a close on the conversation. Happy to take any queries if there are anything. I'm going to look at the chat box, and if there are queries, happy to answer them for now. Let's see. Okay. Search is an important ingredient. Okay. What does ESG and C stand for? Okay. I think that was answered, I believe, environment, social governance, and culture. But I'm repeating that for you. Then there is the auditors. Yeah, of course. Very important. I'm not denying auditors are not important. But when I'm talking of what the conversation in this particular 45 minutes is about ESG and C, and the focus was on culture, and that's where I did not find them to be that much of an important stakeholder on that line. But otherwise, no denying that auditors, creditors, assurance guys are very important in the important stakeholders in the mix, right? So that's true. Any other questions at this stage? Otherwise, I believe we are good to go on to what I would have called, what is the, I think, the networking launch, and probably discuss if there are any more questions. All right. I guess I don't see any more questions. I'm happy people found it interesting, and we'll see what comes out of it. If you have queries, if you have questions, I've left my contact details on this last slide. Feel free to get in touch, and we could always have a conversation. And this is a passion subject for me and my team. We'll be happy to kind of discuss this with you at length if you wanted to, right? So that's where I think we could leave this for now. Thanks for being around. Thanks for listening in, and yeah, happy conversations in the rest of the sessions that are happening during the summit. Thank you, everyone. Bye.